You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel. Chapter 10. Abduction. The next few days seemed like weeks for Mark and Jane. Every spare minute of their time was spent dismantling the machines which had suddenly changed their lives and indeed threatened it. It was true that all they had to go on was the video evidence and the story told by Davenport and supported by Mark's boss. But with all things considered, that was more than enough to convince them to act quickly and cover their tracks carefully. By the end of the following week, all the collected EEG traces and recordings, together with the video cassettes, computer software, hard disks, and floppies, had been fed well and truly into the hospital's incinerator beneath the towering twin-chimney landmark of Addenbrooke's Hospital. All that remained was the device he'd constructed to create the video output to the monitor screen from the EEG tape modulations via his computer program. This was disposed of mainly by use of a sturdy pair of pliers. He tried hard not to think of the hours he had spent making it as the pieces clinked into the bin. One thing he was pleased about was that he had a knack of remembering detail, and so he was confident that if and when the time was right, he could recreate the transposer amplifier circuit straight from memory. The other of these two vital components of his dream machine was the computer program he had spent weeks producing. By the time he had completed it, all the essential details were etched into his brain, never to be forgotten. This ability to memorize quite complex information had been an absolute boon to him at school and then later on at college. He was able to tap into this supermemory at examination times and pour it all out onto the paper in a very short time. Now, without a trace of evidence remaining, either at the flat or his lab at the hospital, he and Jane began to relax a little. Dr. Carlston was pleased, and he and Mark had many occasions to speak at length about psychology, which was now beginning to interest Mark. They were becoming more like friends than boss and worker. Since that night, they shared a common bond, a bond of fear that the organization, as they called it, might one day, any day, descend upon them without warning for what they knew. Only time would tell. Mark just couldn't bear the thought of forever looking over his shoulder and not knowing who to trust. This realization hung over Jane and Mark like a great black cloud. During one of Carlston's frequent visits to London hospitals, Davenport arranged to meet for lunch. More details had become available to Davenport in the course of his work. He disclosed to Carlston that the staff nurse, Hanson, had been offered a large sum of money to pull the plug on Fraser, but couldn't bring herself to go through with it. That was when the visitor came to sort out the problem. However, what she was able to do was to regularly inform her contact of all she knew about the research work being carried out on Fraser by Mark under the supervision of Dr. Carlston. She knew Mark was collecting data into a recorder of some kind, which he then took away with him. She had secretly observed his activities, and on some occasions had deliberately gone into the room to check the life support system to see if Mark was doing anything of a suspicious nature with the EEG monitors. She had reported that during these occasions, especially when no one else was in the room, she had been tempted to go ahead and sabotage the vital umbilicals which were keeping Fraser alive. Carlston, as an ex-MI5 psychologist, was also monitored, being Mark's boss, and naturally thought to be overseeing his research work, although at the time he didn't know of Mark's homework. Davenport was soon a dead man. He was discovered by a group of late-night revelers hanging by a piano wire beneath London's Southwark Bridge. Carlston was devastated to hear of his friend's death in such a terrible manner. Mark and Jane were fond of the frail old gentleman, with such a great concern for their safety without much thought of his own. Carlston knew the techniques which would almost certainly have been applied to him in order to get him to reveal other names. He felt sure he wouldn't have spoken of anybody, even under the most intense forms of torture and interrogation. He would have been a true professional to the last. What would the organization have made of Mark's work on Fraser? Certainly, there was no way they could have found out about the dream recorder. Hanson couldn't possibly have known anything about that. Could she? These and many other thoughts plagued Carlston as well as Mark and Jane. Things were getting a bit too warm and uncertain. An evening was set aside for discussion. Jane had prepared a meal and expected Mark and Carlston to arrive at about 8. Soon the familiar silver BMW came to a halt outside the flat. Jane waved from a net-curtained window and returned to the kitchen for final preparation to their meal. They both arrived in the flat looking pale and concerned. It was Jane who always had a ready smile, which was always most welcome. Mark often wondered how much this whole business worried her. He felt angry with himself for ever having involved her in such a problem which she didn't in the least deserve. "Right then," Jane said, clapping her hands. "What would you like to drink, Dr. Carlston?" "Well, for a start, I would very much appreciate it if you would call me Ben. Out of hours, that is, and I would like some red wine if you have any, thank you." Jane disappeared into the kitchen, arriving back moments later in a dilemma. "I don't seem to be able to shift this wretched cork," groaned Jane, with the bottle between her knees and the embedded corkscrew firmly held in both hands. "Here, for goodness sake, let me at it," insisted Mark. The bottle gave such a loud squeak and a resounding pop. "Mark, what was that?" Jane turned her head. "What was that? What, Jane?" "That thump as the cork popped. I think it came from out the front somewhere," insisted Jane. They all moved over to the window, with Ben commenting on how good the dinner smelled, raising his nostrils in an exaggerated fashion. "It's your car. Some silly buggers hit it." "Oh, Christ, no! I just had a dent in the bumper fixed a month or 2 ago." It's a hell of a lot worse than the bumper, I'm afraid." Ben leapt to the front door and out the street quickly, followed by Mark. They knew Bateman Street was a bit on the narrow side, but this looked deliberate. Smashed into the rear of Ben's beloved BMW was an old beat-up Capri, but no one was there. Their first thought was that whoever it was had just panicked and ran. But there didn't seem as if there was enough time. There was a person crouched unseen down in the driving seat. Ben peered right into the Capri's open window and found himself looking down the barrel of a shotgun. Neither men moved. "Is there anybody in there?" questioned a concerned Mark. Quietly, Ben answered, "Yes, there is someone. I don't know what to do." Before anything could be done, another car screeched to a halt behind them, as the man with the gun sat up and jumped from the Capri. "Just get in the car," were his only words. The shotgun barrel was placed beside Ben's left ear. Everything had happened so fast, just as if for all the world time had hiccuped on by 30 seconds or less. The two men could do no other than fall into the back seat of the other car. The gunman then slammed the Capri door with such force that both Ben and Mark thought it was a shotgun blast in the confusion and instinctively cowered into the seat. And then he climbed in next to the driver. Jane's scream merged with the squeals of tires on tarmac as the car sped off towards the main road and headed in the direction of Trumpington. Some neighbors rushed into the flat to catch hold of Jane as she slid down the window to the floor, screaming uncontrollable obscenities.